Great. Hello, everyone. I welcome everyone to our webinar today on changing solidarities and collective action in times of pandemic. I'm very happy to have 6 very renowned international speakers here today from different continents and world regions to discuss the very important topic on how the pandemic is affecting social movements around the globe. Of course, COVID-19 and its consequences affecting all social relations, political and economic systems, and therefore social movements. On the one hand, we see a lot of new restraints and challenges for activism, collective action and solidarities. And on the other hand, we can see that social movements have become more important maybe than ever before, providing help to those in need, helping to contain the virus, but also showing all signs of solidarity and providing solidarity work. Before we discuss now all these issues with our speakers, let me just give our audience a few remarks on how the seminar or how the session will work today. Everyone can pose questions in the Q&A session, so please, as soon as you have important questions, just write them down and we will check and select, and afterwards you can join in this way in the debate, and the chat function will be deactivated. If you would like to address a certain person directly, please add the name and add to the name. We will have first a presentation of all the speakers for 5 minutes, a short input, and then we already start the Q&A session, and so that everybody has the opportunity to answer the questions afterwards. So let me please introduce you our speakers today. You can see Donatella Della Porta. She's Professor of Political Science at the Scuola Superiore in Italy and also Director of the Center of Social Movement Studies. Breno Bringel, he's Professor of Sociology at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, and he's also the President of the Research Committee on Social Classes and Social Movements of the International Sociological Association, ISA-RC 47, who is co-hosting the session today. We have Supurna Banerjee. She's Assistant Professor at the Institute of Development Studies in Kolkata in India. We have Kate Alexander, Professor of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, and she's also the Director of the Center for Social Change. We have John Krinsky. He's Professor of Social Science at the City College New York in the US, and he's also the Director of the program Community Change Studies. We also have Geoffrey Players. He's Professor of the Sociology at the University of Louvain in Belgium, and he's also the Vice President for Research at the International Sociological Association, currently in charge of organizing and reorganizing the ISA Forum in Porto Alegre, which will now take place in February next year. Thank you very much, and we now start and discuss the following 3 key questions. How is the pandemic crisis and its social, political, and economic implications affecting social movements, protests, and collective action, not only today, but maybe also what you think about the near future? What new threats do you see for social movements, but also maybe political and discursive new opportunities for organizing collective action and solidarity work? And what new forms of solidarities do you not only see nationally, but also transnationally emerging? We start with Donatella and Aisha down.
Hi, thank you, Sabina. And I wanted to map, in fact, challenges and opportunities. And being optimist by nature, I would like to start with the challenges and then move to the opportunities, which I also see growing. So from the point of view of the challenges, we are living in a situation in which political opportunities are reduced, reduction of freedom of movements, power to the expert, need to trust governments. Discursively, challenges are also there because there is a focus on emergencies. Emotionally, there is a lot of fear, which is usually not favorable to collective actions. Resources are difficult to mobilize. I mean, the street is almost impossible, even if not totally impossible. And from the point of view of the framing, there is for sure a tendency toward dystopias, fears, emergency type of thinking. But I think we also see that there are now and there will be in the future opportunities on all this level. At the political level, we see that in an optimistic view, you can say neoliberalism is dead because of the crisis showing the need for collective intervention. And the weaknesses of the past, in particular on issues such as health and public health, but not only on those. The challenge to anti-science type of attitude that has been quite widespread in right-wing populism. And there is, I think, also something that was important for social movements in great emergencies in the past, the fact that the governments know that they need the citizens. So these are all political opportunities that can be used in the future. From the discursive point of view, there is opening coming from the recognitions that there is a need to change all, that there is a need to address the deep causes of the pandemic, which are not natural and are not divine. They are related with a lot of the problems of our times that social movement had pointed at in the past. We see emergence of solidarity and hope that contrast fear. At the level of the resources, what we have seen is the creation immediately, I'm thinking about Europe, but also in the United States and elsewhere, of horizontal networks to address the crisis. And these are networks that will tend to remain in the future. In terms of framing, I think the movements have nowadays a most important role in constructing knowledge, in putting together not only expert knowledge, but also practical knowledge, and in connecting the different types of crisis. So I think this element of building possible utopias, constructing different future is recognized as not only possible, but urgent. And what I see also is the fact that movements are very inventive in terms of how to protest in times of lockdown. So that we had protests from the balconies if you couldn't have them on the streets, protest using cars if you couldn't walk, protest using email. This is my note that I'm running late with time. But I think that these are also important elements that will be also important in the future, which type of innovative potentials movement are developing in order to be able to protect, notwithstanding the fact that you cannot go in the street. And this is most important because it is from the protest, I think, I'm Rosa Luxemburg followers in this, that solidarities are constructed, identities are constructed, and networks. So thank you.
Brenno.
Thank you, Sabrina. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending on where you are. Thank you very much, Sabrina, for organizing this webinar. On behalf of the ISA Resource Committee on Social Movements, I have to say that we are very happy with this discussion with great colleagues from different parts of the world. I would like to start by saying that the first phase of our crisis deals with emotions, as Donatella have already mentioned. Not only fear, but also the overwhelm and anxiety with the lockdown, the frustration against the feeling of impotency and perplexity about the unknown. But the second phase, and maybe more important, it's material. Lives at stake, jobs at risk, the inability to pay a rent or mortgage. In extreme case, difficulties in accessing food. And the crisis seem to show the worst and the best from people and makes the deep inequalities of our societies very visible. In several countries of the global south, this is reflected even in the possibility of having access to water, to wash our hands, or in face of being able to do confinement or not, due to precarious housing conditions and the wave of informal work. In general terms, more than fear of the virus, we're dealing mainly with the fear of its social, economic, and political consequence. Lockdown is necessary, but social movements remind us that some of the exceptional policies we're living are just unsustainable. In fact, they didn't start with the coronavirus, and in some cases, they will probably not stop after the end of the pandemic. The militarization of life and territories, mainly in the global south, is increasing in a context of an unprecedented historical acceptance of biopolitics by the population. Social movements are also denouncing that we're living under permanent surveillance. Let's just mention big data control, the new facial recognition device, and other sophisticated forms of social control. I think that activisms around the world are warning us how coronavirus cannot serve as an alibi for the strengthening of authoritarianism, the restrictions of freedoms, and democratic breakdowns. However, this is only a partial picture. Social movements are not just in displaying a kind of defensive repertoire, criticizing and denouncing the consequence of the pandemic. In my view, and this is the main point that I would like to share with all of you, the coronavirus crisis has also generated an unpredictable opportunity for social change. This is related to the political learning that the current situation contributes to make visible. I'm thinking here specifically in some claims that have been constructed and defended over the years by different social movements, but which, due to the pandemic, are beginning to have an echo in society as a whole. I would like just to mention a few of them, mainly 5 political learnings from social movements to society in these times of pandemics. The first one is the struggle against anthropocentrism. If the coronavirus emergence itself is the result of our ecosystem imbalance, just over a week of car and flight restrictions have served to make most of the world's capitals see their stratospheric pollution rates drop by half. And this reminds us that without fighting against climate change for alternatives to a predatory development model and for environmental justice, there will be no planet or life that will be sustained in the near future. A second societal learning of contemporary politics is the centrality of care as a way of sustaining life. Feminists have been insisting on it for a long time, and the current lockdown with children unable to go to school, the whole family under the same roof, makes it even more explicit. To avoid that care's tasks continue to burden almost exclusively women's bodies, quarantines can be a turning point for men to be actively involved in a radical change of scenario, transforming the organization of work at home and beyond. And this is a key path to build more egalitarian societies and anti-patriarchal alternatives. A third element of political learns, and perhaps this is the most visible one, has to do with the defense and reconstruction of public service. After decades of public service privatization by neoliberalism, the fight against the coronavirus has made visible the importance of free and universal public health, as well as the centrality of public funding for socially relevant research. It's about a priority to life over capitalism, something that in exceptionally way we have at this moment, although we don't know for how long. Fourth point, the pandemic also exposes the importance of communitarian life. It's something paradoxical, but in a moment where isolation has an eminently individual character, multiple social and collective initiatives come to value common life. People feel alone and are more vulnerable, That's true, but empathy, solidarity, and mutual aid and support networks have also been enhanced. There are many, many examples. Young people buying food or medicine for risk populations who cannot leave their place, families willing to care for children from other families who have to continue working, initiatives that promote exchange and barters, pressured by both the closure of shops, but also by material needs. The last point is related to food. Buy food is one of the few reasons why we can live home. The media reproduces images of queues of people in supermarkets, but what is really at stake is the right to food. For decades, peasant movements and food networks caught our attention to an unsustainable and concentrated model of food, claiming for food sovereignty as an alternative. At times like this, more than ever, the population as a whole begins to think about what and how it's produced, consumed, and distributed. And the choice is clear. Either there is a radical change in the food system as a whole, with relocated chains and sustainable and ecological products, or we will move towards a new food catastrophe. I will conclude. In the face of the emergence caused by the health crisis, social resistance, as Donatella also said, is not restricted to our balconies and windows, neither to digital activism, as some people have said. It's not a matter of idealize these initiatives I have just mentioned and others, but resistance today is also taking root in diverse collective actions that glimpse the social emergencies of a very necessary transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Supurna?
Okay, I'm going to turn off my video because my internet is not that good. I'm also very happy to be a part of this panel, and I'm going to speak a bit more specifically in terms of India, but a lot of this would also find echoes with what has already been said and probably what is going to be said. So the COVID-19 crisis comes at a time of overpresence. The last 6 months in world over in India has been one of intense handholding, at least for many of us. Building human barricades against undemocratic laws, bodies came close to each other in resistance and in solidarities. People walked on streets, sat in and held hands as human chains, and in general occupied public spaces together. How do we then deal with the need to recede from these streets, from each other to the confines of our homes? When the very touch of another human being, the very presence of another body in close proximity becomes a threat, how can then solidarity play out? In a country like India, with a very limited reach of digital activism, such questions of sustaining and creating solidarities pose crucial questions for social movement actors. We all know that, and Bren was just talking about this, that public health crises are never indiscriminate. Without the luxuries of social distancing, with high comorbidity, less or no access to healthcare and testing centers, the poor in countries are definitely going to be more affected if the outbreak cannot be contained. What we've seen in the case of the Indian government is, rather than adopting a national disaster policy aimed at placing the most vulnerable at the center of its relief measures, it has given out meager relief packages, and the lack of clarity and focus on gimmicks has actually exacerbated the already existing widespread anxiety around the pandemic and what its economic and social costs would be. As the pictures of migrant workers walking for hundreds of kilometers, children eating grass, road accidents, and resultant deaths circulated, it has become increasingly clear that a public health crisis has escalated to a humanitarian one. The function of activism, as I see it now, becomes twofold: to resist such anti-people stance of ruling and creating social solidarity among communities and groups to function in this period of physical alienation. The pandemic and the consequent lockdown, as we know, necessitates big movements on the streets and squares to move into smaller acts of solidarities in the neighborhoods. Community kitchens run in different parts of the country, in Lucknow, in various cities, in Kerala, in Kolkata, Delhi, among others, seem to be nodal points for this. Food and cooking together has been seen to be one of the oldest forms of showing solidarity. Following all the requirements of hygiene and distancing, these kitchens have seen strangers banding together to prepare meals to be then distributed among those suffering from food crisis. In a caste society like India, with its stigma around washing dishes and cooking together, community kitchens are of a special importance in combating this grammar of difference. Community kitchens become sites of caring. They become sites of social solidarity. Through different modalities, cooking protest food defy the anti-poor, anti-democratic, hierarchical social political order that we have been living in for so long. It shows us an alternative way of living and sharing, not just for times of crisis, but as a way of reorganizing our socioeconomic life. The COVID-19, deadly as it is not the first pandemic to have affected the world, neither this country. The plague outbreak in 1898 and the Spanish flu of 1918 illustrated how disease and policies around it are never just medical, but are embedded within the politics of the socioeconomic fabric of the economic order and the social order that we live in. Both these crises brought out sharp critique against the then British state and its negligence of the medical infrastructure of the country. At great human cost, the pandemics provided a momentum to rebuild solidarity, to re-evaluate alliances. Learning from the ways in which the state responded during these crises crafted new dimension into the critique of colonialism and imperialism. This moment of crisis of the neoliberal, unending consumption-led world might once again lead us to question the tenets of economic organization of such capitalist growth with minimal attention to basics like health and education. With physical distancing as a need of the day, the society can only function through reimagination of social solidarity. This is a moment in waiting, but it cannot be allowed to become an empty moment of waiting. Crises such as this, with anxieties, lockdowns, and global panic, are perfect moments for authoritarian governments to increase their power, as we saw right now in Hungary. The outbreak of COVID-19 and mediated frenzy around it likewise enables governments like the Indian government to wipe away from the public memory powerful protests against it. I end with an imagery of the slippers left by protesting women in one of the sites in Delhi called Shaheen Bagh, which remind the state of their presence in their absence. These became powerful expressions of solidarity. In such times, acts of remembering and remembering together, re-evaluating and reimagining communitarian spaces become central to creating spaces of solidarity and of visualizing a future which is discontinuous with the present socio-economic order that we live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Supurna. Kate.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for organizing this webinar, very important and well timed. And thank you also for inviting me to participate. Firstly, some context. South Africa came late to the pandemic. The first confirmed case was only on the 5th of March. A national state of emergency was, state of disaster, sorry, was announced on the 15th of March. The crackdown, a 21-day lockdown, came on the 23rd of March, and our first death was on the 27th of March. Yesterday, we had 1,380 confirmed cases, so much less than those numbers in some other places, although the most in Africa, with five dead. There's been some suggestion that what we've got so far is a wave which appears possibly to be flattening, but it's a wave of largely middle-class infections. And what we're all very worried about is that we'll have a second wave of infections which will be rooted in the townships and informal settlements where the population is much greater and much denser. And given South Africa's level of inequality of resources and incomes, with about 40% of the working age population unemployed, the virus is likely to spread very, very rapidly. It's already clear that the state lacks the capacity to respond adequately to what's been happening. Pronouncements are made, but not carried through in practice. The police have been too weak to impose restrictions on queues, so physical distancing is not abided by. In informal settlements, many of them some have fence yards where it's possible for kids to play, but many don't, so people are hanging out on the pathways. There are also reports of heavy-handedness, however, and the largest union in the country now reports 3 dead killed at the hands of the police or the army. So 5 dead from the virus, 3 dead by policing. Testing, as in many other countries, is completely unsatisfactory. Government can't keep up with demand. But here again, the inequality shows through with private clinics capable of testing. So there is a recognition growing within government that it needs to involve civil society, but it doesn't yet know how to do this. Its first stance appears to be to work with its traditional allies, some of whom are much weaker because of the kind of politics we've experienced over recent years. Politics which have undermined the governing party, partly through its neoliberalism and more recently through a high level of corruption. In general terms, South Africa had a very high level of protest, particularly in 29, record level in 29, but already in terms of absolute numbers, there's a decline since the clampdown was implemented. But that doesn't mean to say there haven't been any strikes. Strikes in the food industry, strikes in tires, strikes over dismissal without compensation, disputes over safety. So a mixture, different kinds of disputes amongst those workers regarded as essential and those workers who are regarded as non-essential and therefore worrying about pay, reduced hours and dismissals. There have also been many disputes, protests over water particularly, but other service delivery issues as well. Toilets, police have been very ready to use rubber bullets against people. People have countered with stones, with barricades, and the fairly traditional forms of service delivery conflict. In these situations, the good activists are overwhelmed and many are exhausted, and that's a major problem we face and I'm sure exists in other countries as well. One of the key things that's emerged is a great deal of unevenness both within unions and also in terms of community-based organizations. The unions suffer from a chronic lack of coordination. Existing unions have been often demoralized by what they've experienced over recent years. Half of them haven't produced statements about coronavirus yet, and they're having to deal with many of the issues that I've indicated already. The main federation, COSATU, is aligned with the ANC and it appears to be waiting for a lead. The new SAFTU union, a left-wing breakaway, has suffered partly because its main leader, Zwelinzima Vavi, has been infected by the coronavirus, and its other leaders are relatively weaker. Some unions, unfortunately, have been rather propagandistic in the way in which they've operated, denouncing capitalism without really delivering much on the ground in support of their unions. That hasn't been true across the board. Some independent unions have worked very effectively, and there's a casual workers advice centre which has been providing support for strikers and workers in difficult circumstances. The biggest mobilization so far, most effective one, has been amongst taxi drivers. In South Africa, taxi refers to the minibus form of public transport. At the beginning of the lockdown, the taxis were expected to operate only 8 hours a day, 4 in the morning, 4 in the evening, and they had to half the number of passengers that they could carry. This immediately imposed a cut on income, both the taxi owners and the taxi drivers, and there was a threat of strike action. The government appeared to have conceded an enormous amount of ground, but the effect of that is that taxis are now crowded once again, therefore increasing the likelihood of the spread of coronavirus. In terms of community-based organisation, the most exciting initiative, and we were asked to comment not only on challenges, but also on opportunities. The most lively organisation is one called the People's Coalition, initiated in Cape Town, but with a strong task force in Gauteng, the most populous province in the country. I'm involved in the working group responsible for community organising, and one can see there that some of the organisations which used to exist are no longer there. Some of them are reviving, some of them are quite strong and healthy, organising house-to-house calls, mapping to see where the most vulnerable people are located, trying to draw in resources in order to provide sanitizer and gloves, and beginning to provide food for people as well. But funds are very short in South Africa. It's not easy to maintain this level of mobilization, and that's another problem that we face. The unevenness is both in terms of mobilization and an organization, but it also reflects the nature of South African society. The suburbs are relatively well-resourced, calm, very few people moving around, and able to maintain themselves quite effectively and able to protect the people living in those communities. The big problems are in the townships and in the settlements. Many of the townships are formal and have yards and fairly quiet and fairly well organized. So the big problem is in many of the informal settlements and in those townships which are more crowded with shacks at the back of the houses. Those ones are the ones likely to suffer. I don't know anything about faith-based organizations. Some of them seem to be doing quite well. Others are very concerned about how they deal with the dead and how they can organize respectful funerals for the people. As for the future, I think it's very difficult to tell. Clearly, class conflict continues during this period. What will happen in terms of civil society, again, is difficult to work out. The state is not very competent. Civil society is disorganized, unevenness both in the state and in civil society. So one depends upon the other. One is also conflicting with each other. So it's a contradictory position. I suppose if we were to look for parallels in history, we would say that wars and even pandemics can lead to an increased level of tension and an increased level of conflict, sometimes with benefits for the poor and for the working class, reduced levels of inequality following the plague, for instance, and reduced levels of inequality following World War I and the Great Flu pandemic. But at least at the moment, in my view, it's too soon to say, but I would very much like to hear from the other panelists on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. John.
Yes, hello, and thanks again to Sabrina and everyone, and to Jeffrey for dragging me into this very good company. I hope everyone here is and can stay healthy. As Sabrina said about the Global South, the kinds of inequalities that you see in the Global South are played out as well in New York, which is where I live, which is really the big epicenter of the virus and the pandemic in the United States. Homeless activists are trying to remind people, for example, that you cannot shelter in place or stay home if you have no home, and you can't isolate if you're being held in jail. And it's worth mentioning, of course, that the United States has the world's largest prison population. It also, the conditions in jails are absolutely horrific. We also have the detention centers, the migrant detention centers, where again, people are being just routinely and neglected to the point where there's going to be significant death there. It hasn't begun yet, but there's no indication that it won't. If you look in New York, the maps that we have of positive tests, even taking into account inequalities in testing, look a lot like a map of wealth and racial inequality in New York City. And part of this is also due to the fact that what counts as an essential worker or who can still go to work includes not just medical professionals, but also food service workers and delivery people. And these tend to be lower paid workers and people of color. And people who, because they're already poor, are less likely to have regular health care and consequently worse overall health. So precisely the people that we've deemed essential are the people who, in any case, are at greatest risk. They're also people who are more likely to live in overcrowded housing. Now, in all of this, though, there's one of the things that's become very evident, and I'm sorry, I'm a little bit fixated on New York, both because that's where my research is, and also because I'm a New Yorker and I'm provincial in that way. But the importance of movement networks is very clear right now, and I should also say that nonprofit organizations are anchors of community-based politics. Of course, not all nonprofit organizations are the same. And despite its general oddity and inherent contradictions that I think a lot of observers of American movement politics, or US-based, I should say, movement politics, see, these organizations, a lot of these organizations are absolutely central. And the networks of organizations and activists have been getting more dense for at least 10 years. And they were already fairly dense, but in fact, Occupy Wall Street was a big spur in the sort of densifying and unifying of networks across different issue areas in New York City. And I think that some of these dynamics have played out in other cities as well. It's also important, and partially this has to do with Occupy as well, that these organizations have generally developed a self-consciously anti-capitalist politics. And these anti-capitalist politics have gotten more pronounced. Part of it is also that a lot of these organizations are filled with low-wage immigrant workers, often from countries where an anti-capitalist politics is much more common than it is ordinarily in the United States. And these networks have had real success at the state level, where a lot of policy is made in New York and in some other states as well. Last year, for example, the housing movement organized not just in New York City, but across the state, which is something that's remarkable for us. One, historic changes in rent laws, changes that directly challenge the finance and insurance and real estate sector, particularly finance and real estate. And in a sort of a historic set of reforms on the state level. And these were networks, these same networks were networks that mobilized on two fronts just now. First, these networks mobilized very quickly for a moratorium on evictions during the crisis. And this happened quite quickly. The mobilization happened quite quickly, and the successful announcement of an eviction moratorium also happened fairly quickly. The second thing that these networks have mobilized around are mutual aid networks, and this has been true both on a neighborhood level and across industries, such as with restaurant workers and domestic workers. And these groups have been important. The latter two groups, for example, have been really important in immigrant rights coalitions as well. At the same time, the housing coalitions haven't yet had the power to enact a rent forgiveness program, which is something that they're really trying to do. In spite of the technical possibility of this, given the terms of the bailout package passed by Congress. And we just had, our Congress passed a really terrible, generally, bailout package, which is $2 trillion, a quarter of which is just a slush fund for the administration to dole out to its friends in corporate America. But certain funny rules in it actually would enable landlords to get help from the government, which means that tenants, if they can't pay, shouldn't pay their rent. But we haven't had an official program. We haven't gotten yet an official program for a rent forgiveness. There are also, of course, continuing threats to the future of civil liberties and rather desperate threats both to the economy and the environment. The Trump administration is in the process of rolling back a lot of environmental regulations and various other kinds of official review under cover of the coronavirus. And it has, of course, nothing to do with anything but it's disaster capitalism, again. The other thing is that the movements and these movement networks have no executive power in spite of real allies in the state legislature. Now, I don't know if internationally the New York governor, Governor Cuomo, has sort of hit the news, but he's big in the United States because he holds daily press conferences that are sort of models of rational discourse in contrast to the presidential narcissistic ramblings that we get every day. But at the same time, Cuomo has used the current crisis and his visibility and popularity in it, and the inability of others to gather and protest, because surely they would have shut down the state capitol. And Cuomo has used this to push through a budget just last night, early this morning, that contains rollbacks of a lot of the policy victories that activists in New York have won around bail reform and some around housing, but also about he's instituted, in the midst of this crisis, deep cuts to hospitals. So the question, I think, will be whether and how direct action will work, both as the crisis plays on and as the immediate crisis subsides and recovery begins. Mass rent strikes may happen by default because people can't pay their rent. In the last month alone, 10 million people applied for unemployment benefits, and many more haven't even applied. But what will it look like in several months when bills come due and the hyper-wealthy are still wealthy and more, and yet the eviction moratoriums will sunset? I think those are the real questions. And the more that these networks can remain active, and they've been learning to do so through remote outreach and meetings, the more this will become a moment with potential for real upheaval. Without this, and in areas without this, I think we can expect to see more authoritarian responses. But also, as Donatella said, visible forms of protest keep hope and a sense of collective efficacy alive. So I guess I want to conclude quickly with this idea of new threats and new forms of solidarity. I think something that has already begun to emerge and already had begun to emerge are potential alliances against financial capital, especially with respect to housing markets, as well as now we see, the last few days, strikes against Amazon and other delivery services precisely over health threats. So in contrast to what Kate just described in South Africa, workers are actually walking off their jobs because their employers aren't providing enough protection to their health. And we live in a country, of course, where healthcare is not a right. But also neoliberalism is not completely dead. I would say maybe it's undead. It's not even on life support. And that's not just because it's impossible to get ventilators. It's undead. It's a zombie, but it still has a lot of brains to eat. It makes movements that much more necessary. And it's sort of the neoliberalism may have lost its ability to capture people's imaginations as if it's a good thing, but it's still very much imposed because we don't have a cohesive alternative that we've been able to, that movements have yet been able to push forward strongly enough. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We already have a lot of important and interesting incoming questions for all of you. So Geoffrey is next, and I think we just make one round of Q&A afterwards. So anyone wants to pose some questions, and I'm grouping them into different categories and groups so that we have enough time for answering, and so that all the speakers can also maybe pick up points from another speaker when they like to.
Hello, everyone. So let me start by thanking Sabrina for this really great initiative. It's fantastic to be able to see, to listen to colleagues and friends from all over the world to think together what's happening today and why social movements are still important today. So, of course, that's for me, it's a major question that to see that how the COVID outbreak has interrupted a historical global wave of citizens' mobilizations. We may think that the current context is not the best one for social movements. Demonstrations are not possible anymore. And more importantly, maybe everyone is looking again at state governments. They call for unity. They strengthen themselves as authority and gain some legitimacy by dealing with this crisis. And some even look at authoritarian governments like China and Mother of Hungary as the most efficient actors to deal with the crisis. So that's a really dangerous and difficult time for social movements. And it seems that we are back to see we are back to see governments and states as the central actors, not only collectively in our societies, but also in our lives. So do social movements still have a role? Of course, here we are with the president and vice president of RC47 social movement. So I cannot say that social movements don't have a role in this period. they are very important. And of course, as Donatella, Breno, and Sabrina have already pointed, social movements are far more than protests. It's also very much about fostering new forms of solidarity. I'd also like to underline that social movements are also spaces for popular educations for their members. For instance, I've read a few interviews by protesters or former protesters in Iraq or in Chile. They say basically the same thing. They say that the current crisis is actually giving more weight and strength to their own claims, the arguments that neoliberal policies should stop, and that inequalities, that we have to tackle inequalities. So the crisis seems to strengthen the arguments of the movements, and also to give some have some popular education to the participants. It's very clear the case in France with all the yellow vests. Many people are seeing the government, the state in different way. They get different forms of different channels of information. So that's all very important. This popular education aspect of social movements. I would, however, like to dedicate this short intervention, this short talk, to another key role for social movement in our society. That's the fact that social movements are also, and for me foremost, producers of meaning. As many of you have said, crisis is clearly also an opportunity. It may open the horizon of possible. Now, I have also some problems there, because when I see my Facebook page, when I read my friends and colleagues, or notably in open movements, I see that so many people say, and we tend all to agree on that, that we will all argue that this crisis it proves that neoliberalism is really dangerous, that we need, it is required to have substantial policy changes towards more solidarity and stronger public services. So that's for sure something we all share, but now will it happen just because we share it? Well, there are sometimes we think that there is some hope when listening to some European state leaders. For instance, very, very neoliberal French President Macron, he talks now about economic sovereignty. He considers nurses and medical doctors of public hospitals as public heroes. He's just after cutting a lot of budget for the hospitals. So even we now listen to slogans like human before profits. These are major alter globalization or progressive slogans. Today, it's even used by state leaders. And even Macron asks for more state regulations and interventions in the economic sector. He asks to limit free trade. So it seems to be a triumph for progressive movements. The problem is for me that it echoes very much a discourse by another right-wing neoliberal French president 12 years ago. 12 years ago, on October 23rd, 2008, Nicolas Sarkozy said in a public discourse, I quote him, "The ideology of the dictatorship of the markets and public powerlessness has died with the financial crisis." This was Sarkozy, right-wing president of France, in 2008. And unfortunately, we all know what happened afterwards. This was something like almost a consensus in 2008. A few months afterwards, major lobbies managed to convince the European Union and more states that what was needed was not less finance, but more finance. And we know that there were then austerity programs, more financialization, zombie neoliberalism, and the rise of right-wing populism and authoritarian regimes in Europe and in many different countries. So will the progressive movements triumph today where they failed 10 years ago in the aftermath of the financial crisis? I think this is a major question here. Of course, we may see some hope. We may argue that we have been through an exceptional wave of social protest, that the citizens movement wave has spanned over all a decade, and millions of citizens have learned how to see the world differently. They have taken distance from neoliberal policies and regimes, as John just said. And so this is certainly something important we have to take into account. At the same time, I would argue that the last decade also showed us the strengths of reactionary movements, racist and populist leaders. We also have seen that, and we should not forget about that, how the strengths of the capitalist ideology and movement from above, like the work by Barrington Moore and our friends Rowan Cox. Movements from above, defenders of global capitalism, managed to maintain the capitalism and neoliberalism after the crisis, they managed to reshape public debates. They managed, even that's really fantastic, they managed to pass over the burden caused by finance to welfare states and the population. So that's why I think that when we look at social movements today and social change, and we may take just 5 lessons from the previous crisis, from the last decade. The first one is that good arguments are not enough. We may argue that we need another world, that this is required today, there's no other option. Well, then what happens after 2008, the 2008 global financial crisis showed us that, of course, all the global justice movement experts had the right arguments. They showed why the crisis occurred and that we needed different policies. Well, it didn't happen like that. They had all the good arguments, but lost in terms of politics, and we had on the opposite a decade dominated by austerity policies in most countries. Second point is that definitely social change doesn't come from the crisis itself. It's not because there's a crisis. Crisis may be an opportunity, but for who and in which way? So what is important to me is, and I guess for most social movement scholars, is that the social change may come from the crisis, but it depends on the meaning provided to the crisis. The meaning that the way social movement and progressive actors, conservative actors, impose in public debates. And this meaning, there's a very strong and important struggle over the meaning of the crisis, of the meaning of the pandemic, and what may be possible solutions. It's a debate. It's crucial today. That's already started. It's not only about the best argument. It's not about what is most efficient, what is fair. No, it's a debate. It's going on between actors, and it's about producing knowledge and meanings. That's the key role for social movement. Also, managing to impose it in the public space and in a public debate. Then that's my third point, is that today, if social media allow for an easier expression and diffusion of alternative meanings of the crisis, not only government discourse, it's also a very fragmented public space. So we may all see our Twitter pages and Facebook pages full of in an almost general consensus to say we need more public services. At the same time, we see very different things. John just told us that in the US, it's the historic economic package, is just all the opposite of strengthening public services. It's an economic package for big businesses. And the fourth point is definitely that when we consider social movements today, we should not only look at progressive movements, we should actually also now study how reactionary movements interpret this crisis, and how this movement from above, movement to defend global capitalism, are giving a very different meaning to this crisis and its possible outcomes that we try to do from our sides. So it is important to see how this struggle over meaning has already started, and it will obviously last for a few more months and years. So after that, I would like to conclude that sometimes when I read so many colleagues saying that something good will come out of the crisis, well, I guess for me it's not only wishful thinking. It's possible, but it's by no way the obvious outcome. This will depend on social movement, the battle over meaning that has started and will go on a few years afterwards, as we saw in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And therefore, and this is the last and fifth lessons I would take, is that the path towards social change in the 21st century remains to be invented. That social movements have a lot of good ideas, good arguments. We have social media. At the same time, we can see from the past decade that this progressive movement haven't been able to impose these ideas, these policies, and that's why they have explored many things. And I agree with Breno, Donatella, and Supuna, who insist on the importance of solidarity. But at the same time, we also have to face the fact that the dominant meaning of the previous crisis and the policy that came out of this crisis were not dominated by progressive actors, but opposite by reactionary actors and by the capitalist actors defending capitalism.
Thank you very much to all of you. And we had a lot of debates going on in the Q&A section, and we got so far around 50 questions, 50. I grouped them into different sections, and I will summarize them and now post to all of them. And then I suggest we start in the same round because we have only time now for doing one round. But this debate will continue and we will have different and further sessions. So if one of the audience feels the aspect is missing, there will be more opportunities in the future. So one group of questions was related to the relation to the state and your opinions on how is it affecting the relations to the state. Do we see, and there were very diverse questions going in different directions. So do we see new alliances with the state, a closer connection of social movements with the state, versus the complete opposite? Are now social movements and horizontal networks becoming much more important than the state and being like an alternative and restructuring societies from below? Is this the direction you see everything going? Or do we see more movement parties emerging in the wake of the crisis? Or do we see maybe as a response to the crisis, but also to social movement activities, the return of the welfare state? So one direction, a set of questions was going into this direction. A big bunch of questions was related to all your presentations discussing opportunities and threats and also strategies. So we had couple of questions asking, so when there are opportunities, what would you suggest social movements to do to make use of them? How can they do that? What kind of resources can they use? And what kind of strategies are much more adept? So is offline, and questions came back to offline and online mobilization. Do you see now an increase in a more effective ways in online mobilization versus offline? But also there were critical questions concerning, should even social movements now use the crisis as an opportunity to push for some of the frames and things they have mobilized for? And you all mentioned different aspects to that in the past, or isn't that also delegitimizing movements if they do now push for certain things too hard now in this crisis situation? And also, we do know that movements mobilization is also reproducing inequalities within societies. And isn't the problem that particular marginalized groups now have even more difficulties in mobilizing, in particular groups and people who have non-citizens status, refugees, asylum seekers? What about all those groups, people of color and low income, precarious people? Isn't it becoming even harder for them? So how can they strategize in the system? A third bunch of questions was related to the idea of local solidarity work versus national and transnational or global ones. So isn't this relocalization showing that solidarity works best locally, but globally it's very challenging, or transnationally it's very challenging and very difficult to establish and maintain? So what about, for example, refugees and refugee camps now in the situations we see, but also how are people in the global north dealing with the significant problems in the global south and so forth? So isn't it rather that we see a desolidarization even within movements? And I think I stop here now and give everybody of you an opportunity to answer. Donatella, you go first.
Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you for all the ideas by the other panelists and the questions by the public. I think we will need some more webinar to address them all, but I think it is a good start. And what I wanted to mention is something that I had not mentioned in the beginning, is that I think it will be a hard struggle. So it is not this that the crisis automatically defeated all the challengers and the opponents of social movements. But I think the readings of the past decades as a reading of defeats for movement is something that I do not share. I think that in the past there have been battles that have been lost, but also battles that have been won, and we have to learn from both. We have to learn also from the different conditions in different countries, the different strategies that movements have used, and the way in which sometimes they brought about victories. And I don't think we have to forget this. I think movements never thought that they could win only by having the good arguments, but they organized in different forms. And this has been most important in order to create also the alternative knowledge and the alternative solidarities. I think something we have to consider is that in many parts of the world, the epidemic arrives in a moment in which movements are very mobilized. So the fall of 2019 has been a fall of rebellions, revolts, struggles, and so on. And of course, they are challenged by the closing down of the streets, but they, I think, are still very much alive. What we can see in terms of political opportunities is, I think, also the opening up of potential spaces. Someone has asked in particular about movement parties. Yes, they could emerge, but what I think could also happen is that some of the political parties that are already there, that's usually we define as center-left parties, from the Greens to the Social Democratic parties, can be made more sensitive to some type of issues. About the resources and the strategies that one could use. I think that usually social movements are more successful when they use different strategies and at the same time, and they can do this because there are networks of different types of organizations. We are studying about solidarities with migrants, refugees, and so on, the sort of hybridization of different forms of organizations, from the more structured type of civil society organizations to the grassroots type. And I think this is a process that will continue, because what emerges at the moment is also a basis of intervention through emergencies in which different groups meet on the basis of the need, on the basis of the emergency, but also with the creation of specific spaces. So I think that services, creation of public spaces, alternative knowledge, protest will be all important strategies that movements will use, but that also within the movements there will be networks that will be more oriented toward transnational type of actions and more local one. What we know is that the movements that been sort of directly affected by the pandemic were movements that were very horizontal, that were very participated, and I expected this will be a sort of continuous tendencies. Repression, zombie neoliberalism, yes. In fact, I think this is a moment in which there are many different actors that are trying to exploit the situation. Crises are not easy moment, because we see that the usual suspects are mobilizing, financial institutions, financial speculators. There is the risk that the search for sort of trust in government can give power to the dictatorship. But I think that nothing will happen automatically, neither the mobilization and the victory of progressive social movement, nor their defeat. So I think that strategies will be quite complex. I've seen also there was a questions about the changes in research, which I think could be mentioned in closing my round of responses. I think that what we perceive, at least I perceive as very urgent, is a move out of a specialized type of disciplinary knowledge and the need to develop transdisciplinary knowledge. Plus, of course, also a big need for developing knowledge that can be applied to the emergency. So this double type of pressures. So I think that this type of knowledge should be also used in order to analyze the different ways in which different countries and different movements have addressed the pandemic. So need for cross-national analysis, because I think that what we have seen is that the world is not easily divided into democracies and authoritarian states, but there are also a lot of differences in the degree of responsibilities of the states for suffering of the citizens. What we see, for instance, now is that the type of developments in the most neoliberal states, from the United States to the United Kingdom, are visible in the most dramatic effect in terms of inequalities. The final note about the protest of the powerless. I think what we have seen is, for instance, in Italy, even capacity to protest by the people in prisons. But of course, also in this case, it is not automatic. And so what I think is needed is the creation of spaces for encounters of the different actors. And I would like to talk a lot, but also I would like to listen to my friends, and so I will stop here. Thank you.
Yes, I think we will maybe take 10 more minutes for the whole session, so that everybody can now give also answers, and we use the same order as before. So Brenna, you are next.
Okay, thank you all very much for these great insights, and also for the comments and questions. It's impossible to answer everything, but I agree with Donatella that we need another webinar to continue the debate. But I also agree with her comments, so I will try to contribute with another points. Maybe two specific reflections. I would like to answer, to dialogue with Joe's question about what discursive strategies are available. I think this is a very important question, because in this moment, what we are seeing is an attempt to displace this kind of exterior discourse, speaking for or on behalf of others, to work with images, with direct messages that make more visible the political learns that I have mentioned before. So even for those people who don't have an activist background, but are suffering the crisis, that are inside their place, I think this is quite effective as a way to change the habitual, the current ways of previous discourse. Of course, this can happen through WhatsApp, social and digital networks, informal and local strategies of solidarities, but they can't circulate in an abstract way. They have to appeal to everyone. This is quite important. But I think the most important question here is that there is something quite interesting about crisis in general, and specifically about this one, and is that what was absolutely unimaginable weeks, months, or years ago may be possible now. So some discourse can be radicalized because we're facing an emergence and an exceptional moment. This is applied to states, but it can also be applied to social movements. I think in recent years, many of social movements have been much more defensive, defending their rights, defending also their territories against extractivism, against authoritarian governments, but now they can be much more proactive. I think the current scenario allows this from my point of view, and this reconstruction of discourse, I think it's a very important question that you have to follow with more resource and following also the movement strategies. I also want to comment very briefly a question about how the crisis affects the way we do social science. I think this is a very relevant question, because the first practical consequence is that we are here with around 300 people from all regions of the world discussing alternatives and solidarities. Of course, this could be done before, but we didn't. What I mean is that a more global outlook at social science is essential. It's a key question for us to better understand the crisis and its possible solutions. There is a lot of proposals about global sociology, global views, but I think in moments like this, we usually go to the local scale, and this usually have the opposite effect. We strengthen the positions that focus on one place and one state. They close the borders of the countries, as we're seeing today, but the borders of knowledge can be not closed. And we need much more knowledge being produced within and with social movements, with hard science, and so on. So I think this is a key moment to do this. Colleagues from other areas of knowledge, from different people from different expertise outside the universities are also willing to collaborate, and think this is an important initiative and moment to this kind of cross fertilization and transversal kind of reflection and research.
Supurna? Your tone, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just going to not try to answer all of that, but just add a few things to what has already been said. So again, this idea, the question of the relation to state, and I think this is one of the things that has been different across different contexts. And I was thinking in terms of some states who've worked with social movements in this time of crisis, in terms of working with social movements in distributing relief, in trying to find out how to address the more vulnerable population. And these have often been states. So I'm thinking in terms of Kerala, which is a small state within India, which has shown the best kind of response to the entire pandemic. And it's been one of the states which has been actually in the forefront of working with social movements, working with transgender activists, working with community leaders, working with Dalit activists in pushing forward reliefs and thinking of what is needed. So that's one side of it, but also as we close national borders in different parts of the world, one of the things that is becoming more and more clear is that at this moment, the nation states become really important. They are the ones people are really looking at for relief. And as has already been said, that this could range from being very democratic to very authoritarian. So there is both evidence of certain forms of alliances being formed with the states across states and movements, but there's also evidence of how states can use this moment to become more and more powerful, more and more more and more authoritarian. This also then makes it the question of refugees and refugee camps then becomes all the more difficult, because the moment it becomes the question about citizens protecting your closing borders, the most precarious groups, and we've read about how refugee camps and places like this have been kind of left to its own device. So I think it's one of the important things for social movements to not kind of forget to talk about and continue to demand reliefs and protection for these refugee camps around the world. And the last thing that I want to say is, and this of course doesn't answer all these questions, but just this one last thought, and then we could talk about, I think is in terms of, I think this question of scale of protest is also very important. So there are multiple things going on. Nothing has really stopped in terms of domestic violence. So there is also a need for movements which talks about which looks at the question of domestic violence, where there's been clear increase with the entire lockdown, to the forms of movements which are talking about degrowth, the need for listening to questions of climate change, questioning capitalist economy. So these different scales are all important. The different levels are all important, and this is probably the moment to understand that there's a need for a lot of conversation around these if social movements have to strategize and come out of this crisis, or lead the way out of this crisis. And I'll stop there.
Kate.
Okay, great. And it's lovely to listen to all of my friends on the panel. Okay, again, I'm just going to pick and choose a few questions. I mean, there was a question about online and offline, and I think it's very obvious that this is leading to much greater use of online communication. I mean, in my university, and I'm sure in the university of other colleagues, there's an attempt to move to developing an online university. But this is really ridden by class divisions. You know, it's okay for people in the middle class suburbs of Johannesburg to make use of computers, but most of our students have been sent really back to their home areas, rural areas of South Africa mostly, and some of them to other countries, Zimbabwe and so on and so forth. So many of them they don't have electricity, they don't have data, even if they can get access to data, they don't have the money for the data, they don't have computers, so they're trying to work on smartphones at best. So there's enormous class division opening up there in terms of education. There are implications in terms of research, not just in terms of transdisciplinarity and so on, but just the practicality of how do you do research? And I'm sure other colleagues would have had these difficulties with their own research students planning to do fieldwork, but now they can't move around. They're frightened to move around. There are regulations that stop them from moving around. So you have to try to reorganize all the research projects so they can be undertaken in some way through online interviews and so on and so forth, or developing new projects about the coronavirus pandemic and its effect on society. Or we're doing it now, a very big, I'm hoping to do a very big survey of 4 million people, but we can do it online. So I think that there are ways in which we have to reorganize like that if we're to survive in terms of developing an intellectual and research project. This also affects the way in which we organize as activists. I mean, even despite the inequality of South Africa, we're now beginning to organize ourselves, certainly in the main committee that I'm involved in, on an online basis. And there's far too many of these meetings because we've got subgroups and everybody's got their own community networks and things like that. So it's very, very exhausting. And the main means of communication are just like this on Zoom and linking that to WhatsApp. Those are the key things. And that's the shift we need to understand. Twitter is there, Facebook is there, but there's some recognition, certainly in my part of the world, that Twitter is a largely middle-class form of communication. Facebook is actually regarded as being rather more working class, and WhatsApp is definitely more working class because it's linking together communities. You know, we talk about fragmentation of communities, which is going on, but there's also this development of communities. WhatsApp groups often linked to geographical or neighborhood communities, people having to communicate in that way to organize soup kitchens and so on and so forth. Now, there was a question raised about horizontal and hierarchical organization. Well, I think that's fascinating. You know, it seems to me that again is still to be determined, really. I mean, there was a question about the environment, I noticed, but the main pre-existing organization concerned with horizontalism was Extinction Rebellion, and many of the Extinction Rebellion activists have now come in and joined and participating in the solidarity work that's being undertaken. But I think the method of organizing has had to change as well, because you haven't got the pace, you can't kind of relax and develop organization over a long period of time. It's an emergency. You know, we have to have meetings now that are 45 minutes long. People have to click, 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 quickly, come in with the answers. There isn't the time for nice, relatively slow debate and plan something in several months ahead. So there is an element of hierarchy involved in that. There are different committees, and you can't work through different hierarchies of committees in order to do the job if you've got completely decentralized organization. So I think there's a combination of both things going on. It was an issue about working with the state. Look, I think you have to work with the state. We haven't got an alternative as activists and people trying to understand activist organizations. Civil society doesn't have hospitals, you know, so what do we do about it? You know, we've got to work with the hospital system. In South Africa, one of the problems we have at the moment is permits, you know, for activists to move around, to provide solidarity for those who are most vulnerable, who need the food, who often really lack an understanding of what's going on at a very basic level, to move around. Really, you have to get a permit. Sometimes there are local deals with the police, but you have to get a permit. That means the state. So you've got to apply for the permits. The state doesn't really want to have all of the activists moving around, and there's a high degree of skepticism on both sides, particularly given the number of service delivery protests that there's been. But parts of the state realize they've got to work with civil society. Civil society often realize it's got to work with the state. So it's a new kind of period. It's a completely new kind of period and new problems that we've got. Now, clearly there are possibilities there of co-option, you know, that the civil society can be co-opted by the state, but the state isn't, certainly in South Africa, isn't all powerful. And so we're having to work with the state in order to maintain some level of independent organization, in order to retain some possibilities for autonomy, for linking together with ordinary people, for linking ourselves together at a regional and national level. Now, I think that's fantastically important, because those parts of civil society who are not involved in that process, who are not involved in understanding this is an emergency where the first priority is to stop people from dying, those who are not involved in that will fall by the wayside. So it's critical that we organize independently, but at the same time also organize alongside the state. Now, finally, it seems to me that we are still victims of pre-pandemic politics. And one can see that in different ways in terms of the way in which the state operates, in terms of the divisions within civil society. Now, how that really evolves over the time, I really don't know in the South African case. It's still early days for us. I mean, you know, some of the colleagues, you know, were speaking with a degree of confidence because they've got much more experience than we have in South Africa about this. But I really don't know how the thing will be determined. And so then, this is my final point. I'd be very pleased indeed if you organise another forum like this in a few weeks' time, and then I might have something completely different to say.
Yes, thank you. John, your turn.
I was muted. I enthusiastically started in. Yeah, thanks everybody, both the panelists for the answers so far, and really to the people asking questions. Just a few quick, a few things. One is, in response to questions about immigrants organizing on their own. Yes, I think that one of the things, certainly in New York City, is that that's largely what's happened, and many of the immigrant groups are the anchors of at least one of the key coalition clusters in the city. And in some of my research, even before this, I was looking at different kinds of clusters of groups that were mobilizing around the city around different issues, and really finding that they were very, very tightly linked. So immigrant self-organization is a key to understanding anything in the city's, especially labor movement or workers' movement, but also in everything that touches. So it's not just a question of people organizing to help vulnerable populations, it's these populations organizing on their own behalf. It's also important to think about vulnerable populations who aren't detained as well as those that are detained. But then you also have similar kinds of things, like in Los Angeles, you have homeless people taking over houses, a push to empty shelters and to get people who are in homeless shelters into apartments and less crowded. Prisoners are on hunger strike in various places. The flip side of that, of course, and I agree, somebody just thanked Suparna for bringing up domestic violence, and that's a huge problem, and a huge problem in terms of how to organize around it. That's one place where the kind of isolation is a terrible difficulty to get over. I'm not entirely sure how that can be done. But it speaks also to this question on a much more theoretical level of rescaling and localization. And I think that depends a lot on what exists before. Rescaling has already been underway and it's very uneven. There are coordinating elements on a national level that are actually quite helpful, whether, though these don't have to be on a national level. They don't have to be on a national level. In other words, there's nothing inherent in these coordinating functions that are coterminous with the nation state. But just as so it's likely that there's also, we're going to see more international and global coordination, but the question is always how this treads down in local and national context. So Kate just mentioned how, we need the state, we don't have an alternative. The question is also what level of the state. Most states themselves are fairly variegated. There was a question also on sabotage and tactics. And I think my answer to that is it depends. The problem with sabotage is it's rarely a movement strategy in the sense of having larger scale collective accountability in the kind of societies we live in now. It may have a role, but in general, I wonder whether the absence of the possibility right now of assembling masses together, or in this absence, sabotage won't only extend the justification for state repression. So this is a strategic question and therefore one that shouldn't be answered in a blanket sort of way. But I think that it's important to really understand the massive opening for state repression as well. What also seems clear is the COVID crisis. The COVID crisis is a threat to existence and not just the existence of capitalism, but to people's lives. And that's showing in ways in which we are, showing us ways in which we're more connected than we think or usually acknowledge. And it's also showing the ways in which neoliberal policies are deadly in ways that have become much more concrete. But we can't count on these ideal representations diffusing without there being constantly said and repeated in and through the movement networks that already exist. So, we have to rely on the movement networks that already exist, including also trying to build them out. But right now we're in a position where expanding them may be somewhat harder. Even though the potential for sort of ideological resonance is there. And of course, the potential for right-wing groups to deepen their links to state power are clear, and not just because they're buying guns. Nicholas Pohl asked a question about people buying guns in the United States. I also wonder whether the people who are buying guns aren't the people who are already buying guns. And yet the discourse of emergency makes right-wing control a short-term problem with longer-term consequences. And the question for left-wing politicians on one hand and movements on the other is going to be whether we make a stance of complete refusal or a stance of reform. And again, Nicholas asked a question about Bernie's support for the terrible bailout. And that suggests some of the second, a stance of reform rather than complete refusal. He got a meaningful expansion of unemployment benefits in the bill. I mean, a really meaningful expansion of unemployment benefits in the bill. And so therefore, it's also a question that we need to ask about what we can do to show on the left, for example, that we can deliver material benefits in order to maintain credibility among people so that we can have these larger conversations. So it's a sort of standard strategic problem for the left, but it's colored now in the difficulty that we can't actually amass people in ways that we could before. So I said earlier that, absent COVID, our neoliberal governor would have a much harder time pushing through the budget because all of these groups would have gone up to Albany, New York, to the Capitol, and shut the place down. I'm quite confident of it, but they couldn't this time. And so, that kind of thing, that kind of opportunity still exists for people in power, is to, do the disaster capitalism thing or its functional equivalent on the state level. And I'll stop there. But thank you again, everybody.
Yeah, I also have the feeling we could continue for now a very long time, but I give the last words now to Geoffrey.
Yes, thank you. I just want to reply to one of the questions about replies to the crisis by capitalist states, just stating that it's also important to see that all capitalist states have do not have the same responses. And that's also where the connection with social movements is different. For instance, when we see the discourses by Trump, Macron, or Merkel on this crisis, it's totally different. And here, I think that something that Merkel said that was very important is that she said something like, we are democratic society, and democratic societies are societies where our decisions are transparent and based on science. This is something based on science. It's something very different from other leaders, in particular Trump. And so science is a key component of this kind of democratic society. And that's also really where the struggle today is also a struggle over the meaning of democracy, not only by social movements, but social movements have long experience in that. And the meaning of democracy has always been a core element of social movement. We all believe here that social movements have many things to bring in this debate. And here's where also it's we cross a line. It's not just a big capitalist bloc on one side and other social movement, progressive movement on the other ones. The lines are blurred today, and Merkel discourse here was in many aspects interesting. And just to, so of course, this is kind of opportunity where social movement may contribute in a different way. I really like also Kate's intervention, stressing the importance of redefining, or maybe not redefining, but finding new ways of finding back some old ways of redefine the relationship between civil society and the state. And of course, we need the state, but it may be different. Solidarity economy, the idea of regularizing production, not only, of course, also welfare state and public health, that's key today, but also about relocalizing food, masks, and having some kind of sovereignty. That's all, these are all alternatives brought by social movements. And of course, I didn't want to say that social movements have lost all the battle, no, but at the same time, we see the Trump bailout shows that they may not win all the battles. I would also like to say the last word is that to say if science is important in these debates, of course, then probably Merkel thinks more about medical doctors, epidemiologists, and maybe a few economists. I would also say that social science are so important today because we are also producers of knowledge. And especially today, I would once again thank Sabrina for this initiative because it's about bringing social science much more into this debate, but also a more global science. We need to learn from people, from colleagues, from social movement, from different countries, from different continents. And that's a paradox because today it seems that we are on one side far more national. The key actors are national. All the statistics about I'm always very upset by national statistics on this, on the coronavirus. No, it's much more local, regional, national, and global altogether. And the virus is partly an outcome, the way it spreads, it's partly an outcome of our global age. But of course, some of the solutions will also come from this global age, both on the capitalist side, maybe with finding out viruses, finding out vacuums, but also on progressive alternatives. And that is why we need more spaces to talk among us. So from social sciences, but also between social scientists and social movement from different parts of the world.
Thank you very much, Brenno. And I saw all the interesting questions coming up and much more topics also from the audience. So I would like to invite everyone listening or joining in, if you want to contribute and also say more, use the open movement platform. We have already short pieces of some of the people from the audience where they lay out more ideas, but you can also contribute and send in a short piece, a short article, or you can join the email lists, the email list of the ISA RC47 social movement list to further exchange ideas and also to get more information on future activities. And I would also like to thank the support team who really helped us figure out how to do it. In particular, me, I'm super stupid with Zoom. I learned a lot. Thanks to Nolly Hollwinkel, to Elias Steinhilper, to Julia Jorch, and to Marianne Bote for their great support work in the background. I hope to be able to continue the conversation with you all soon, and I would like to say goodbye to all of you now. Thank you very much.